While the Chinks had been puffing themselves half-witted on opium long before the first foreign trader put his nose into the Pearl River, there's no doubt that our own John Company had developed their taste for the drug back in the earlies, and before long they couldn't get enough of it. This didn't suit the ruling Manchus, for while they were as partial to a pipe as the next heathen, they saw that it was ruining the commonalty, and who would hew the wood and draw the water then? These Manchus, you see, took all the plum posts, ran the country with a sloth, inefficiency and waste that would have shocked a Bengali babu, forced the conquered Chinese to wear pigtails as a badge of serfdom, and sat back in complacent luxury, growing their fingernails long, cultivating the more rarefied arts, galloping their concubines, developing a taste for putrefied food, preaching pure philosophy and practicing abominable cruelties, exalting the trivial and neglecting the essential, having another romp at the concubines, and generally priding themselves on being lords of creation, which, since they hardly admitted the existence of the world outside China, is what they were. So, you see, they resented white interlopers who bade fair to undermine their empire with poppy drug. To their chagrin, they discovered that their God-given superiority, their highly refined taste in eggshell pottery, and their limitless lines of ancestors availed nothing against any Dundee pirate with a pistol on his hip and a 6-pounder in his bow who was determined to run his opium in, which made the Manchu mandarins wild with outraged pride and more high-handed towards foreigners than ever, with the result that war broke out in 1840. Being Chinese and useless, they lost and had to cede Hong Kong to us and open up treaty ports to European trade. And the poppy running went on as before, only more so. You'd have thought that would teach 'em manners, but not a bit of it. They convinced themselves that we foreigners were only there on sufferance, and they could treat our traders and emissaries as dirt. They knew China was the master of the world, and that everyone else was barbarian filth. What, admit us as equals? Trade freely with us? Receive our ambassadors at Pekin? It was unthinkable. The Chinese for ambassador is tribute-bearer, which gives you some notion of their conceit. You have to understand this Chinese pride. They truly believe they have dominion over us, and that our rulers are mere slaves to their emperor. And you won't teach John Chinaman different by blowing his cities apart with artillery. Well, if a footpad knocks you down, it don't follow that he's your superior, does it? So, even after we'd licked them and gained a trade foothold in the treaty ports, they continued as arrogant as ever, and finally overstepped the mark in 56, boarding the British ship Arrow and arresting her Chink crew, because one of them was believed to be a pirate. Before you could say snooks, we had bombarded Canton, and the local mandarin was offering $30 for British heads. I believe it might have blown over if the clown Cobden, abetted by Gladstone and Disraeli, there's an unholy alliance if you like, hadn't worked himself into a sweat in Parliament, saying it was all our fault, and it was a scandal the way our opium traffickers abused the Chinese, who were the most saintly folk on record, while British arrogance was a byword, and we were just picking a quarrel. More shame to us. This had Palmerston spitting his false teeth all over the shop. He damned Cobden and the Chinks for rascals both, said our honour had been flouted, and anyway, we had only bombarded Canton with the utmost forbearance. Good old Pam. And was Cobden aware that the Manchus had beheaded 70,000 folk at Canton in the past year, and were guilty of vices that were a disgrace to human nature, eh? Fine parliamentary stuff, you see. And when Pam lost the vote and had to go to the country, he won a thumping majority, which was what the old scoundrel had been playing for, and the Chinese war was on with a vengeance. It was a scrappy business, but after we took Canton, the Chinks had to climb down and agree to a new treaty, admitting us to inland trade with ambassadors at Pekin. But being still as arrogant as ever, they dragged their heels about signing. And when we sent a fleet up the Peiho to persuade them, damned if they didn't have a sudden burst of martial valour and handed us a splendid licking at the Taku forts. So now, in the spring of '60, with an uneasy truce between Britain and China, Hope Grant was coming with an army of British and frogs to convoy our ambassador to Pekin and make the Emperor sign. Which brings me back to the point where I agreed to escort the carpenter's cargo of poppy up the Pearl, with a prospect of 1,600 sobs and a fine frolic with dear Phoebe when I got back to Hong Kong. Mind you, as I leaned on the rail of the lead Lorca, bearing up beyond Linton Island, with the rising sun rolling the fog banks up the great estuary, I could honestly say it wasn't the cash or the lady that made me turn opium runner. No, it was the fun of the thing, the lure of sport without danger, the seeking for fresh sights and amusements, like this magnificent Pearl River, with that wondrous silver mist that I suppose gave it its name, and its fairy islets beyond the Tiger's Gate, and the dawn breeze rippling the shining water and filling the sails of the stubby junks and lorcas and crazy fisher craft, and the pug-nosed, grinning Hong Kong boat girl rolling her poonts on the thwart of a sampan and shouting, "Hiya, Captain! Hiya! You want your jiggy? You pay 200 cash? Drinky samsho? Jolly jolly?" "Who you, Dragon Empress?" says I. "Come aboard, 100 cash, maybe all same, samsho." They're the jolliest wenches, the Hong Kong boaters, plump little sluts who swim like fish and couple like stoats.